All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for a star-studded panel. We're going to be talking about institutions and institutional adoption of DeFi. Before we kick it off, I'm Tracy. I am a Deputy Managing Editor at CoinDesk, and I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists who maybe just briefly introduce yourself, your firm, and kind of what your firm does. Why don't we just start?
Yep. OK, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Liebau. I'm the CIO of the Modular Blockchain Fund. Modular Asset Management is a Millennium spin-off, fully regulated investment firm based in Singapore. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and let's see how it goes.
Thank you. I'm Liz Mathew. I run business development and partnerships for Metamask Institutional, owned by ConsenSys. I'm based on the East Coast.
Good morning. I'm Jack McDonald, the CEO of PolySign. We have two operating businesses, Standard Custody and Trust, which is a regulated qualified custodian here in New York under DFS. And we also recently purchased MG Stover, which is a leading fund administrator for digital assets.
Good morning. My name is Leon Marshall. I'm the Global Head of Sales at Genesis Global Trading. We have offices in New York, London, and Singapore. We operate businesses in lending and derivatives, where we are the largest, or among the largest, I should say, OTC transactors of lending and borrowing markets and derivatives. We also operate one of the largest spot businesses in the world, custody and staking. It's exciting to be here, and I'm looking forward to this panel.
All right, so before we dive into the DeFi portion, let's kind of define what an institution is. So all of you guys, interact with these institutional investors, whether they are LPs or potential clients. And so what are the types of institutions that you're talking to?
I'm going to start and make a bit of a controversial statement, if I may. I think there are very little institutions, as I understand them, in crypto markets. So some people define it as everyone who's not an individual. When we think about institutions, we think about entities that are sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, university endowments, those types of real money. And I think what makes them very different from perhaps the family offices or even the fund managers like ourselves is that they are very much long-term holders of crypto. So it's very different to somebody who runs a hedge fund strategy that trades all day in and out, in and out. So yeah, I guess that would be my definition.
So we spoke about this earlier, and I have almost completely the opposite view of that.
Great panel. That's going to be a great panel.
In that any non-individual, to me, is an institution or an organization. The fact that coming from traditional asset classes and traditional capital markets, you're almost forced to do that self-selection and choose the largest of funds or organizations because it is expensive to service them profitably. And part of the promise of DeFi or Web3 in general is to be able to have more of a distributed access to financial engineering and other risk profiles, and could be nothing to do with finance at all. It's really about community engagement and a more equitable form of distribution of ownership rights and things of value in general. So on Metamask Institutional, so as a platform, we've been live for less than a year. And we've certainly seen speculative capital be our earliest adopters, but we are seeing several other types of organizations show up. And these could be publicly listed, well-known brand names that are looking at ways to experiment with loyalty points or NFTs as ways to engage with their communities. We're certainly seeing organizations that find themselves with tokens related to Web3, be fungible or non-fungible, and are looking for an institutional access point to be managing and monitoring this exposure. So they really do vary quite significantly. And so we certainly look at it from the perspective of MetaMask is sort of an individual's access point to all things Web3, and Metamask Institutional is any non-individual's access point to Web3.
I would just add, Tracy, I think about the sell side as well. So when we talk about institutional adoption, most people gravitate immediately to the buy side, and I tend to, I think, agree more with Daniel in terms of the breadth of what I consider an institution. But I also think about this ecosystem and all of the sell side firms, whether they're other banks, exchanges. Obviously, there's a large component of corporates who are hovering around this space who will have an impact over time of driving use and adoption.
I mean, just to complete the circle, I think Jack made a really great point there. Look, the way that we see, at Genesis, the way that we see this DeFi moment, and I'll put an asterisk there, because it's not really a DeFi moment, it's more DeFi is here and it's having different chapters and episodes, and we're going through a particular chapter at the moment. It depends what how you define institutional. If you define institutional as, I think I agree with sort of Jack and Daniel, as banks, exchanges, corporates, institutional asset owners, it really depends where they sit on the risk curve, right? So, because DeFi has a lot of promise, and I want to be explicit to say that I'm a DeFi bull, but there are a lot of challenges: regulatory, security, brand, the extent to which you actually understand the incentives, whether it's staking or governance, slashing, the jurisdiction you happen to be in, AML, KYC. So different institutions operate at different points of that risk curve. And that is what defines how they get involved. So they might get involved, for example, through a Genesis, where they say, OK, look, we'll do staking and options and derivatives to you and speculate on the asset class. Or they might get involved through a MetaMask and say, look, we want direct access for ourselves. And then to the extent to which they have customers, they may look to facilitate that. But where they sit on that risk curve is really defining, as far as we can see, how they decide to play that moment.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, I feel like the institutions are coming. They're coming into crypto, and I guess in order for institutions to go into DeFi, they have to first be in crypto. So it is kind of like a funnel. It was probably one of the strongest narratives this cycle. You know, the institutions are coming, and there's probably no doubt that they have gotten more interested in crypto, whether it be buying it on their balance sheet or just you know, even sovereign governments buying Bitcoin. But DeFi is a little bit more complicated, and it's kind of like another step up. And so when you look at the past 2 years, what have institutions been doing in DeFi? And if the activity is not there yet, like what needs to happen for them to then, I guess, take the leap into DeFi?
I would say, we talked, our business is exclusively focused on institutions. And what I would say, to your point, Tracy, is that I think the institutional interest level has continued to rise, notwithstanding the market drawdown. We have more and more conversations with traditional asset managers or sell-side firms who want to learn more about this space. This whole adage of, blockchain, yes, Bitcoin maybe, has evolved. I think everybody is very much of the belief that distributed ledger technology, blockchain technology will have a very transformative impact on capital markets. But in terms of actually investing in the space, we've seen this kind of ebb and flow of actual investment coming in. I think if you look at the trend line, it's been up, but it's been nowhere as steep as what we would all in this room like to see. I think when you get into DeFi, it's a whole nother quantum leap up, and there are a lot of risk factors and questions that need to be addressed first on the more, if I may use the word, traditional digital asset crypto before I think you're going to see any mainstream adoption of DeFi.
Yeah,
Are there any, when you mention things that need to be addressed, anything in particular that stands out?
Oh, I mean, we'll get into them later, I'm sure. But, as just mentioned, I think the whole regulatory compliance considerations, AML, KYC, I believe, and I know we're supposed to all profess replacing trust with truth. The reality is large traditional institutions actually want to know who their counterparty is. They want to trust them to some degree. And so there's going to have to be this middle ground, I think, that's met. I think also custody, and this is self-serving, but I believe it to be true, really needs to be solved for. When you think about DeFi, just to name two significant areas of focus right now for DeFi.
I guess just to build on what Jack said, I think there are also more crypto-native kind of considerations. So if DeFi is supposed to be the next global financial ecosystem, then that ecosystem has some very basic requirements. For example, stability. You know, I think that the second largest DeFi ecosystem, if I'm not wrong, is built on Solana. And we all know that Solana in the past had quite a few issues where it just stopped working. I mean, you look at the requirements, the technology risk management requirements of traditional institutions like banks. In Singapore, of course, everything's like very extreme. But you know, I think a bank gets about 4 hours of downtime per year, right? So if the smart contract platform that DeFi sits on top of cannot compete with that, then that's a problem. Another thing that is also, I think, very crypto native and doesn't really have to do much with regulation is these platforms have to offer price stability when it comes to transaction cost. And you know, when I look at things like, for example, the Yuga Labs NFT mint, where people try to purchase items for $6,000 and pay $14,000 in fees, I mean, how can you build a decentralized financial ecosystem on top of a platform like that? I find that very difficult to envisage. And lastly, I guess it needs to be fair, you know. And I know that there are many opposing views around MEV, I'm sure, in this view. But I think if the very actors that are supposed to guarantee the integrity of the ledger are the ones that are front-running the average user, that's also a problem. So these are just 3 things that I think we need to sort out for DeFi really to strive on these smart contract platforms.
Curious, I'm going to revert back to kind of take a step back, but back to kind of talking about, you know, are institutions realistically here? Are they going to get here soon? We'll talk later about kind of the problems with DeFi and kind of certain barriers, but I'm curious if you believe this narrative that, you know, institutional adoption is coming to DeFi.
So the only customers on MetaMask Institutional are organizations, and I think what we find is that they tend to be extremely comfortable with the operational frictions involved in accessing DeFi today. They are extremely sophisticated. They are typically already power users of the retail wallet and want to be able to now add on some of the operational controls when they as a team are handling a portfolio, dealing with tokens. That being said, there are still a lot of challenges that we are working very closely with our earliest adopters to solve for. Education is certainly one of them. Not the case with the institutions that are on our platform today. I think they're extremely sophisticated, but even for them, like the Wintermute hack that happened earlier this week, right, points to operational security. And so there is a certain level of industrialization and risk management that needs to be incorporated, and a security, a focus on security that might not have been in play as this asset class became quite large very quickly. So we're certainly seeing organizations pay closer attention to that, not only being able to track what is in their portfolio on a real-time basis, but being able to apply some of the discipline required to manage the operational uniqueness of accessing this asset class. So I'd say education is one, but then secondly, just diving into really different approaches in how do you think about security in DeFi is now becoming far more relevant. There is the one approach where custodians provide safe city access for their organizations and say, okay, I can do X number of things and that's it. Then there's the other approach of saying, can I be educated and understand, I want to be able to access all of Web3, but I want to make an educated decision based on a higher level of awareness of what it is that I'm about to do. And those are some of the concepts that we're exploring from a design concept of what is the right framework to be thinking about a scalable way to be designing the security guardrails for industrialized, scalable access to Web3?
The way I look at it is to say, if you're in a pension fund right now, and you are yourself a crypto degen, you love the space, you were a part of Terra when it was a thing, you were allocating to Cosmos, you play around with the protocols, you love it. But you turn up to work and you say, hey, we've got billions of dollars under management, we need to get involved in this space. There are a few things you need to go through. Number one, you need to get stakeholder buy-in. Stakeholder buy-in involves education, ultimately, and then secondly, to convince the folks involved that the risks are worth the return. And what we've seen in our conversations is the risks are clearly AML, KYC, and there are a lot of really great companies doing a lot of great work on the infrastructure side to get over that. So we see institutions investing in the infrastructure there. Number two, we see one of the clearest being security. And this week we've seen a lot of hacks. We saw hacks in the previous week as well. And these are for great companies that really know what they're doing. So when you have that conversation in a pension fund and you say, look, the risk is worth the return or not worth the return, I think it's in that context you have to see it, that regulatory context and that security context. And so what we've seen folks like pension funds do is say, well, look, we're very interested. We still want to look at this space, but we're going to allocate to this infrastructure play first, or we're going to allocate to this hedge fund first. So we've seen pension funds allocate to hedge funds, we've seen them allocate to infrastructure, and we've seen them allocate to firms operating, SEC, FINRA-regulated CFI firms in the space. So far, we haven't seen them say, let's spin up something ourselves and allocate ourselves. I'm actually sure that over time that will happen, but we haven't seen that so far. So I think that's like the thinking, and that's the process that we see. But I'll add one more caveat real quick here, which is there is a macro context here as well, right? So it's not just that there's been hacks in DeFi already, but interest rates are higher, 75 bips a clip each month. So what that does is it actually makes the risk return for saying, hey, that you can get yield on this protocol slightly less attractive, because someone says, well, I can just put it in treasuries. So there is a macro context for how some of the institutions are looking at crypto right now. And also, by the way, you want to keep your job. So when you wake up in the morning and there's a poorer macro environment, like on the margin, I think those conversations in the short term are a little harder.
I had just 2 points to add on to what Liebau was saying. As it relates to the education, I think this is going to take time, but we as an industry, I think, have a responsibility to educate the non-participants of how well DeFi has actually held up over the last 6 months. And most of the challenges that have happened, the headline sort of numbers and firms and excess that has blown up has been really off-chain, not on-chain. And so I think DeFi, actually, when you understand it, should get a positive mark. The other thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge that some of the native crypto funds who are active in DeFi today, who are really institutional in my definition. We've got some clients, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars being deployed, and they have very much of an institutional pedigree. They have an institutional framework with how they're looking at the business, how they structure their operations, and I really think that they are paving the way for that future incremental demand that everyone's waiting for, the pensions, the endowments, or the more traditional asset owners who are not there yet. I don't see that. But the crypto native firms, particularly some of the larger ones, I think are doing the broader industry a real service and will pave the road.
Maybe one thing to add, which is very boring, but totally matters at the sort of allocator level, is tax. So when we set up the fund, we had to think really carefully, how do we generate a structure that avoids double taxation? Investors don't want to be taxed at the fund level. And that is something that is not so straightforward, which we painfully found out. Yeah, but also needs to be taken care of, I suppose.
Leon, you mentioned the macro environment, and it seemed like one of the reasons why DeFi was really attractive to institutions was just the astronomical yields that were advertised kind of in 2021. And we are in a very challenging macro environment, and treasuries, even though rates are going higher, it didn't compare to Anchor's 20% riskless yield. Now that we've kind of a lot of the high-yielding, like triple-digit APYs and these protocols that kind of moved money around in a black box, they've been flushed out. And what is the and we know that institutions they want yield, and so is there still kind of like a benefit? Is there benefit to getting into DeFi for these sky-high yield now that we've seen them come down?
I mean, so what we see, and this isn't just for institutions, this is for crypto natives as well, but at Genesis, we see market makers and hedge funds take advantage of the fragmented liquidity both on CeFi and DeFi. And so they will see opportunities of high yield in DeFi or opportunities to borrow even cheaper on DeFi, and they can do the other side of that transaction for us. So I don't think that, I still think that that presents opportunities for market makers and hedge funds to operate. What I also see is an increasing amount of innovation both in CeFi and DeFi around the transparency for lending and borrowing markets, for example. And I think what that will do on the edge is it will attract institutional money, which will look at the space and say, well, look, actually DeFi performed pretty well in the events in the summer. Maybe we should allocate there. But at the same time, do I want all of my risk on a protocol? I've seen the very best in the space get caught out. So I think you're going to see funds take advantage of fragmented liquidity, and you're going to see funds take advantage of, frankly speaking, the plethora of different contracts that you have now. I mean, for example, you can do an ETC versus ETH proof of work, like carry trade or swap. That's like a new type of transaction that didn't exist 4 weeks ago. And you can probably do that both decentralized and centralized. So I still think you're gonna find institutions get involved, but I think you're gonna find plays which are a little bit more interesting than I'll just send it to a protocol and get some yield.
I think also whether or not institutions are actually investing yet, I think they are watching the efficiencies that are happening in this space. And it would be one of the, I think, lures that attract more and more institutions over time when these other areas have been addressed.
I hope that the next leg up in these markets is very much driven by the adoption of the DeFi systems themselves. So if we think about the value propositions that DeFi ecosystems are supposed to bring to the table, I hope that they are more than just financial markets that speculators can make a clip in. You think about issues like, for example, financial inclusion and banking people who perhaps do not have opportunities to invest or even get credit because they don't have a credit score. You think about composability and how efficiency gains can be achieved by interaction of different smart contracts, for example. These things are quite interesting, and I hope that if enough people start using the systems, then that also counteracts a little bit the tension that we have right now, where you get a bit of money on your cash in the traditional financial ecosystem, and it sort of helps distinguish DeFi with its sort of native yields.
I think this is such a peculiar asset class that has such a more, it is such a different operational cycle to deploy in Web3. There is no comparison to any other asset class that we've seen before. And so given the steep learning curve that anyone needs to go through, be it retail or institutional, most of institutions, as per your definitions, are not involved for the price action. They are involved for the education and for the long-term play. if you will. So you certainly have speculative capital that are taking advantage of arbitrage opportunities that may be short-lived, absolutely, and that's great because they come in and provide a certain level of liquidity and price discovery. But when we're talking about sort of further up the institutional curve, I think those organizations understand that it's just not an ecosystem that you can learn by reading. Certainly, it doesn't lend itself in the same way that you learn. You don't even read the same media outlets, right? You have to be on Twitter or Discord or Reddit. So there is such a steep learning curve that you sort of have to get involved and go through some of the operational frictions to understand how you choose to fit in this ecosystem. So I would say that at this point, as we've all come from traditional markets, and we are setting up businesses to service organizations that decide their position within the ecosystem, I do think that we need to look at different service models. The existing sort of investment banking style relationship account management models don't quite lend themselves to the challenges that users have today and the hand-holding that they need. And quite frankly speaking, it's a larger set of participants that are showing up, and quite often a very different set of organizations that are leading the way forward. So I think we'd be kidding ourselves to say that we are going to use the same things that worked at JP Morgan and Goldman in terms of how we built an asset class up, talking to the same traditional 100 allocators, servicing them with the same kind of skill sets. And we're going to have to look at a different set of participants that have different skills and different shortcomings in terms of capabilities. So it's going to require all of us to be thinking about different business models in order to service this ecosystem.
I push back a little bit. Of course, fundamentally, I think you're right. But I think it's a mix of the two, right? So pension funds, of course, have eventually an interest to do something in this market. At the same time, there are a whole bunch of people who didn't really play a role, and of course, they are coming in. And I think we're going to see some sort of fragmentation where everyone specializes a little bit, right? I mean, I joined this whole crypto thing in 2016. It was just crypto. Now there's so many different sectors, right? Yeah. You can be an NFT specialist. I know nothing about NFTs, for example. You can be I don't know, we focus on smart contract platforms only, so I understand those. Do I understand everything that happens in GameFi? No, I don't. So I think there'll be fragmentation of these different activities across the platform.
100% agree. Like, it makes it all the more challenging to be running these different go-to-market motions with participants that are so diverse in what they require. 100% agree with you.
Let's move on. Liz, you talked previously about KYC and AML and whitelisting. And it sounds like the version of DeFi that you guys are describing, where institutions would be interested in going in, is kind of antithetical to the values of DeFi. You know, the version that we're describing here is not exactly permissionless. And, you know, we probably have some people in the audience right now at Messari Mainnet that are kind of DeFi purists. And so how can the crypto community kind of manage the needs of these institutions that are very different from a retail user while still kind of staying true to the values of DeFi? Or, you know, is the version of DeFi that we are building for institutions like not really DeFi?
I think that's it. I think there's an element of so what. You know, the purists may be upset, but the only way institutions are going to come in is when these sort of considerations are met. I feel very, very strongly about that. In the same way that I believe the regulation is actually good for this industry. Many would take the counter to that. But if the idea is to increase institutional adoption, you have to address some of these stumbling blocks that are not going away.
I think you're going to see two big trends. I think it's clear that regulation is coming in some way, shape, or form. and especially in the United States. And so what that means for DeFi is that I think you likely have a fragmented DeFi environment whereby you have some permissioned or regulated DeFi environment, and you have one environment which is what we've understood and experienced so far. And you're going to have some set of firms that look to operate in between. And then the next piece I think you will see is you'll see DeFi eating real-world assets and having real-world assets as assets on DeFi. Obviously, firms like Maker have done a really great job there, but other great firms like Centrifuge out in Berlin have done this as well. And some of the centralized exchanges are beginning to offer tokenized assets on exchange. So I think you're going to see that regulation, and I think you're going to see a blurred distinction between what a DeFi asset and what a non-DeFi asset is. I think both are going to be constructed in the long run, but how it looks in the short term, it might look a little bumpy. And that itself presents some opportunities for some firms. But I think those are like the broad trends that I think are here to stay.
I like what Leon said because I'm a little bit of a critic of thinking about things in a too binary fashion. So it's the same thing with decentralization, right? Is it decentralized? Is it not decentralized? Decentralization is a spectrum. Yeah. And eventually, the trend seems to be in the world that we're moving towards decentralization. It doesn't happen overnight. And you know, what happens being inclusive, right? Oh, everyone can join. Oh, but then suddenly institutions cannot join? No, I mean, the ecosystem is so big that I would agree that there will be this fragmentation. And over time, you know, technology also enables a lot of these integrations. I'm super excited about things like zero-knowledge proofs, because eventually that has massive implications on how you can verify a certain identity or check whether they meet certain criteria or don't meet certain criteria for them to participate. All right? Maybe that is one of the solutions that become quite interesting in the context of KYC or knowing who you deal with. Maybe you don't need to know who you're dealing with if you know that a certain wallet fulfills a set of criteria, right? So these things, I mean, I think is all work in progress, as we know. But yeah, I'm quite excited about that. And of course, they all require to be integrated with smart contract platforms, which is what we mostly look at.
I very much echo that sentiment in that it's too early for us to make these design choices. It's too early and it's too vast. And the true use cases of what does well in Web3 and what does well outside is still uncertain. So that's in part of why we have a complete range of custodial solutions on MMI. On one hand, you've got Gnosis Safe that is completely self-hosted, and we have customers that are die-hard passionate and almost to the point of a religion in saying that, yes, we will use our safe wallet on MMI and we don't want to face a vendor. And on the other hand, you'll have other institutions that say, we absolutely need a qualified custodian.
Either by law or just by best practice.
Yeah, and I don't mind the fact that I can't do, you know, tens of thousands of things. I can do just 3 things, and that's okay.
But you're acknowledging the need to have a continuum, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think what's also going to be interesting is how outside of the US the regulators act, because the MiCA regulation was written before DeFi was a thing. So we're about to have a big set of regulation and progress in Europe written without DeFi in mind. Right. So at some point they have to address that, and how they do that is not certain yet.
Okay, so we have just over a minute left. So the last question is just, you know, what is the most exciting thing that you're seeing in DeFi today? And just a one-sentence answer, and we'll go down the line, starting with you, Daniel.
Can I go last?
Okay.
Pressure's on. Pressure's on.
I'll go first. I would just say what I said before in terms of trends. Real-world assets on DeFi is obviously the way to grow DeFi in terms of the value locked in the space, and to integrate it with real-world assets. So the companies that are doing that, I think, are doing a great service in the long run for DeFi.
Okay.
I would say the innovators around integrating DeFi into gaming and all that's happening in that segment of the market.
I would say making Web3 safe for everyone. And because I work on Metamask Institutional, especially for unallocated capital, that is just about stepping in, just making just better awareness, better security guardrails for them to access Web3.
Okay, now I know what I'm going to say. So I'm quite excited about the fact that regulators, for example, MAS, are interested in DeFi. In fact, I teach a class in one of the local universities, and the regulator takes the class. So there is interest, and it's not like I don't want this and per se. Hundreds of people. So it's not like we meet and then we see whether this is for us, and then we make it a binary decision. There's genuine interest. So I think that's very, very good and good note to end, I guess. Yeah.
All right. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists, and thank you so much for joining.